Word of Mouth is an adult story time presented by the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. News stories are posted every month on the second Sunday at 2:30 p.m. If you enjoyed today's program, please consider liking and subscribing to our YouTube page or following our Facebook. As a reminder, some stories contain adult language and content. It is recommended you review stories before allowing younger audiences to listen.
Hello, my name is Thomson, and I'm a reference librarian at the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. This month, I'm going to read to you An Eye for an Eye by Jeffrey Archer. It is his newest release and is available in our library. You might want to put it on hold because there are many people that are interested in reading it. So I'm going to read the prologue in the first chapter or two. I hope you enjoy it. Simon Winchcombe Henry Howard Hartley saw the Prime Minister for the first time that morning, and his father for the last time that night. It happened thus. For the past 200 years, the Hartley family had either taken holy orders, ending their days as bishops, or entered the House of Commons before joining the cabinet as a minister of the Crown. Simon's father, the Right Honorable John Hartley, P.C.K.B.E.M.C., was no exception and ended a distinguished career as Home Secretary before being elevated to the upper house as Lord Hartley of Bucklebury. His wife Sybil was first and foremost a housewife and a mother, who occasionally involved herself in good works, which was no more than was expected of a Hartley spouse. So, when Sybil delivered a son, Simon, all Hartley children were named after disciples. They both assumed he would follow in the family tradition and either become a bishop or a cabinet minister. Had he done so, this tale would never have been written. Their only child, Simon Hartley, showed from an early age that he had no interest in the family tradition. When at the age of 11 he won a scholarship to the North London Grammar School, despite having been offered a place at Harrow, the family alma mater. And on leaving school he progressed to King's College London to study law, rather than going up to King's College Cambridge to read divinity or politics. When Simon graduated 3 years later, he bucked another Hartley trend by becoming the first member of the family to be awarded a first-class honors degree rather than the usual second or even occasional third. And if that wasn't enough, after leaving university, Simon migrated to Boston to join a bunch of colonials at somewhere called the Harvard Business School, an establishment his father wasn't sure he approved of. 2 years later, as a graduate of the other Cambridge, Simon returned to his native soil to be offered a dozen jobs in the city of London, ending up as a trainee at Kestrel's Bank, with a starting salary well in excess of anything his father had earned as a minister of the Crown. During the next decade, he rarely left the square mile, other than to travel to distant lands where he would negotiate deals that left his colleagues in awe, while making a fortune for his bank. By the age of 40, Simon had married a beautiful and talented woman, Hannah, who had borne him 2 sons, Robert and Christopher, neither disciples, and had joined the board of Kestrel's as the company's youngest director. It was assumed it could only be a matter of time before he would become chairman of the bank, and indeed he might have done had he not received a call from number 10 Downing Street asking if he would be kind enough to join the Prime Minister to discuss a matter of national importance. By the time Simon left the Prime Minister's residence, he'd promised Mr. Blair he would consider his proposal and let him know his decision by the end of the week. Once Simon was back on Whitehall, he hailed a cab that took him to Paddington, well in time to catch a train to his family home in Berkshire. During the journey to Bucklebury, he reflected on the Prime Minister's offer and how his family might react to the news. His father would tell him he had no choice, repeating words such as honor, duty, and self-sacrifice. He couldn't be sure how Hannah would respond, although he was in no doubt his two teenage sons would express their firmly held opinions on human rights, or lack of them, in Saudi Arabia, especially when it came to women. Hannah was waiting for Simon outside the station, a sad and forlorn look on her face. He kissed her on the cheek before climbing into the passenger seat of the car and immediately asking, "How's father?" "No better, I'm afraid," she replied as she switched on the engine and eased the Mini out of the car park onto the main road. "Your mother spoke to the doctor this morning, and he's saying it's only a matter of weeks, possibly days, before—" "No better. Excuse me." Both of them fell silent as Hannah drove on a quiet country lane surrounded by acres of green fields with little groups of sheep huddled in corners suggesting rain. "I know he's looking forward to seeing you," said Hannah, breaking the silence. He was saying earlier that there are a couple of family matters he needs to discuss with you. Simon knew exactly what his father had in mind, painfully aware one of them couldn't be avoided any longer. After a couple more miles, Hannah turned off the main road, lowered her speed, and proceeded slowly down the long drive that led to Hartley Hall, a home that the family had lived in since 1562. As Hannah brought the car to a halt, the front door opened, and Lady Hartley appeared on the doorstep. She came down the steps to greet them, giving her only son a warm hug while whispering in his ear, "I know your father wants to see you, so why don't you go up and join him while I give the rest of the family some tea?" Simon walked into the house and proceeded slowly up the stairs. When he reached the landing, he stopped to admire an oil painting of his distinguished ancestor, the Right Honorable David Hartley, MP, before knocking quietly on the bedroom door. It had only been a few days since his last visit, but his father had visibly worsened. Simon hardly recognized the frail figure with thinning hair and a sallow complexion, who was propped up in bed, his head resting against two pillows. Breathing heavily, he held out a bony hand, which Simon held on to, and as he sat down on the bed next to him. "So why did the Prime Minister want to see you?" were his father's opening words before he'd even said hello to his son. "He's invited me to lead a British delegation to Saudi Arabia in order to negotiate a major arms deal." His father couldn't hide his surprise. "That won't be greeted with overwhelming acclamation," he suggested. "Not least by the Prime Minister's colleagues on the left of his party, who keep reminding us that the Saudis continue to outlaw trade unions." "Possibly," said Simon. "However, if we could land the contract, some of those same unions would welcome the thousands of jobs that would suddenly become available up and down the country. Not to mention the millions that would start flowing into the treasury." "Billions," said Simon, and Blair didn't stop reminding me that if we don't get the contract, the French will. "Reason enough for you to accept this assignment, my boy," said his father, "and you are bound to be away for several weeks, possibly months. There are one or two matters we need to discuss before you go." "The old order changeth, yielding place to new," the old man continued, quoting his favorite poet. "So I can only hope that in time you will come and live in Hartley Hall and take care of your mother. 'Tis the natural order of things." "You have my word on it," promised Simon, And I don't want your mother worrying about financial matters. She still tips waiters a shilling and considers it extravagant. Fear not, father, said Simon. I've already set up a trust fund in her name, which I'll personally administer on her behalf, so she won't have to fuss about any temporary financial difficulties. And then there's the important issue, said his father, of what you should do with Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which, as you know, has been in our family for over 200 years. We should have carried out the president's wishes long before now. With that in mind, I made an appointment to see the American ambassador in order to hand over the fair copy along with the letter that shows the great man had always intended it to be bequeathed to the American people. In fullness of time, Simon reminded him. To be fair, said the old man, it hadn't occurred to me that it was of any value other than as an historic memento until I read recently that one of Benjamin Franklin's printed copies of the Declaration sold for over $1 million, which is when I felt concerned for the first time. No need to feel concerned, father. Once the negotiations for the arms deal have been completed, the first thing I'll do when I get home is visit the American embassy and hand the Declaration over to the ambassador in your name, along with the letter expressing Jefferson's wish that it should be given to Congress, which will remind people that our family played their part in a footnote of history. However, the other 5 letters should remain in the family archives and must be passed on to your firstborn, who I do believe I can hear heading toward us. Either that or it's a pack of wolfhounds that are about to appear. Simon smiled, glad to see that his father hadn't lost his sense of humor. He climbed off the bed and opened the door to allow the rest of the family to join them. Robert was the first to greet his grandfather, but even before he reached his bedside, the old man said, Robert, I need to be sure you can repeat the words Thomas Jefferson wrote to your great ancestor over 200 years ago. Robert grinned, looking rather pleased with himself. He stood up straight and began. Dear Mr. Hartley. Date and address, demanded the old man. Hotel de Langeac, Paris, August 11th, 1787. Carry on, said his grandfather. I hope you will grant me your permission to impose upon your time by allowing me to send you my fair copy of the Declaration of Independence, which I earlier delivered to Congress for their consideration. You will see that it includes 2 clauses you and I discussed in London, namely, the abolition of slavery and our future relationship with King George III once we become an independent nation. Copies were made by my friend and colleague Benjamin Franklin and distributed among interested parties. Much to my dismay, with members of Congress divided, both clauses were rejected. However, I would not want you to think I had not taken to heart your wise and sound counsel and tried to convince my fellow congressmen of the merit of your judgment. Once you have had a proper chance to peruse the fair copy at your leisure, perhaps you would be kind enough, in the fullness of time, to return it to me. I thought you would want to know that it is my intention to bequeath the memento to the nation in order that future generations of Americans might fully appreciate what the Founding Fathers were trying to achieve, and not least the role you played. I look forward to hearing from you at some time in the future, and be assured of my sincere esteem and respect. I remain your most obedient and humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. Simon placed an arm around his mother while his son completed the letter, which, like father and grandfather before him, he had learned by heart. And will you promise to teach your firstborn those same words and make sure he can also repeat them by his 12th birthday? Lord Hartley demanded. I give you my word, said Robert. Simon could not hold back the tears when he saw the smile of satisfaction on the old man's face, although he feared he was seeing his father for the last time. Book 1. I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. President John F. Kennedy addressing a dinner honoring Nobel Prize winners, 29 April 1962. When the car drew up outside the club, a guard glanced in the back and nodded before the barrier was raised so the chauffeur could continue on up a long drive, finally coming to a halt outside the palatial villa that could have been plucked out of Monte Carlo. The Saudis can duplicate anything money can buy, thought Simon as he climbed out of the car and made his way into the club. Simon had been in Riyadh for a week, after a crash course of familiarization training at the Ministry of Defense. He had been briefed by a small team of experts who covered everything from submarine pistons to Sharia customs and beliefs, and how to correctly address a prince of the royal blood. Mr. Trevelyan from the Foreign Office had been on hand to assist him, but tonight Simon was on his own. He was about to meet Hani Khalil, the local agent recommended by the ambassador. Although Kestrel's bank disapproved of go-betweens when conducting business in a foreign field, the British government were far less squeamish, not least because their rivals for the arms deal, the French, the Italians, and the Americans, all lived in the real world. Simon already knew that the going rate for an official agent was 10%, and if they were willing to do the job for any less, it was because they didn't have the ear of the minister. If they demanded even more, they were greedy and skimming off from both sides. Simon had wanted neither the former nor the latter, and was well aware that selecting the right person to represent the British for such an important contract would be the most important decision he would make, if they were to have any chance of closing the deal ahead of the French. In the end, he had reluctantly settled on a Lebanese agent called Hani Khalil, who, he had been assured, could bend to the ear of Prince Majid bin Talal al-Saud, the Minister of Defense. It was Khalil whom Simon had been invited to meet tonight at his club a few miles outside Riyadh, technically called the Overseas Club, but known, the ambassador had warned him, as the Compromise Club. As he reached the front door, Simon had only to murmur the hallowed name of Hani Khalil, and he was immediately invited to enter by the manager, who accompanied him down a long corridor into a large palatial room. He was ushered towards a man sitting at one end of the bar, an empty seat by his side. The man wore a smart, fashionable suit that had probably been tailored in Seville Row, and a smile that suggested they were old friends, despite the fact that they had never met before. My name is Hani Khalil, he announced, thrusting out his hand. Thank you for joining me. The defense minister has asked me to welcome you to Riyadh and say how much he's looking forward to meeting you. The same warm smile followed. What can I get you? Just an orange juice, said Simon, recalling the ambassador's warning. Over the years, Simon had often dealt with sharks who swam in the same water as Khalil, some of whom had ended up in jail while others got knighthoods. He had learned to live with both of them. Once he'd taken his seat, Simon's eyes slowly circled the room, which was decorated with expensive paintings, stylish furniture, and available women. A man of your reputation, Khalil was saying, will be well aware there are only two serious candidates being considered for the arms contract, the French and the British. What about the Americans? Asked Simon, well aware why they had recently made a tactical withdrawal. They are no longer in the running while Gore is still hoping to be president, said Khalil. He's clearly not interested in being involved in a deal that might prevent his Jewish supporters back home from bankrolling him. And the Italians, asked Simon, want too large a slice of the cake, said Khalil. And in any case, everybody knows they can't supply the necessary equipment, so they were never really in the game. Although Simon had learned nothing he didn't already know, he was beginning to get a feel for the man who was sitting beside him. He delivered his next well-prepared line, but that doesn't apply to the French. You're right, my friend, and in truth, they're your only real rivals. However, with me as your representative, I can promise you they will be returning to Paris empty-handed, Khalil said, as if the contract had already been signed. And what do you expect in return for your services? Asked Simon. I feel sure you are well aware, Simon, that 10% is the going rate for such deals. 10% of £3 billion is a very large sum of money, Mr. Khalil. And 10% of nothing is nothing, countered Khalil, and you have to remember that the minister has a large family to support, and one in particular who will be expecting to get a big slice of the cake. While, let me assure you, I will have to satisfy myself with the well-earned crumbs. One in particular, repeated Simon. Prince Ahmad bin Majid, the defense minister's second son, who has been a personal friend of mine for many years. Indeed, we have closed several deals together in the past. The Foreign Office had already supplied Simon with a thick file on Prince Ahmad bin Majid, and it wasn't flattering, referring to him as the Black Prince. I've already arranged for you to have an audience with Prince Majid at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Khalil went on, which is why I needed to see you this evening. Simon listened as Khalil tried to reassure his guest, a little bit too enthusiastically, that the deal was already in the bag. This made Simon even more convinced that Khalil and the Black Prince would eventually walk away with several million more pounds deposited in a Swiss bank account, while he was left to explain to the Prime Minister that the deal had been closed even before he got off the plane. Simon sipped his orange juice, while Khalil showed no such inhibitions, allowing the barman to pour him a brown liquid from an unmarked bottle, from which the label of a contented grouse had been removed. He tried to concentrate on what the defense minister's representative on Earth was saying. I see that your Italian rival, Paolo Conti, is with us tonight. Simon glanced across the room to see a man who had an arm draped around an attractive young blonde, while the other hand rested on her thigh. The Italian looked slightly inebriated, but then he didn't have an appointment with the minister in the morning. According to the Foreign Office brief, Mr. Conti was famed for his Italian good looks and mafia connections. And although the Italians were on the short list, it was no more than what diplomats described as a face-saving exercise. Khalil took another sip of whiskey before remarking, and that's another contract he won't be closing. Simon took a closer look at the woman seated next to Conti, who was sipping a glass of champagne. She looked to be in her late 20s, possibly early 30s, and there wasn't any doubt how she earned her living. The black leather miniskirt and sheer silk blouse would not have been acceptable on the streets of Riyadh or even in one of the five-star hotels that littered the city. But inside this private enclave, such rules didn't apply. As the scantily clad women and shelves of unlabeled bottles testified. Conti still believes he's in with a chance, said Khalil, as an attentive barman refilled his glass with another shot of the forbidden nectar. With the girl or the contract, quipped Simon. Both, replied Khalil, but what Conti doesn't realize is that Avril is one of Prince Ahmad's favorites. And if he turns up and sees her with another man, believe me, sparks will fly. The minister's son has a short fuse, and I have a feeling Conti's about to light it. Should I assume Avril is aware of the consequences should the prince turn up? You catch on fast, Simon, so my advice is to go back to your hotel before Prince Ahmad arrives. Meanwhile, I'll remove the Italian from the short list. Unless you want Avril after the prince has left. No, thank you, said Simon. I think I'll take your advice and have an early night. He didn't give Avril a second look as he thought about Hannah, who would probably be preparing supper for the boys while they did their homework. He'd done his homework. All he needed now was a good night's sleep. By the way, said Khalil, as Simon drained his glass, Avril's not French. Her name is Jenny Prescott, and she comes from somewhere called Cleethorpes. Simon laughed as a door on the far side of the room was flung open, and half a dozen men dressed in long white thobs and keffiyehs marched in as they owned the place, and they probably did. There wasn't any doubt which one was Prince Ahmad bin Majid al Saud, or the role his courtiers were expected to play if they hoped to remain on the payroll. The moment Avril saw the prince, she moved back despite Conti leaving his hand on her thigh. The result was quickly what Khalil had predicted. The result was exactly what Khalil had predicted because the prince walked quickly across the room and, without warning, pushed the Italian to one side before sitting down between them. You can fuck off, Ayeti, said the prince, a sentiment that didn't need to be translated into any language. Conti rose unsteadily to his feet, a fist half raised. Although the prince ducked, the Italian landed a glancing blow that knocked off his keffiyeh, revealing his bald head, which clearly didn't please the prince. Simon couldn't believe what was happening in front of his eyes, and it quickly became clear several of the guests were equally surprised. Only Khalil remained unmoved, almost as if he'd scripted it. As the prince adjusted his headgear, Conti began to raise his fist a second time, but not before two of Ahmed's bodyguards came charging towards the Italian, grabbed him by the arm, and held him down. They were about to escort him off the premises when Conti defiantly leant forward and spat in the prince's face. Ahmed immediately leapt on him, and Conti tried to defend himself by grabbing the prince around the throat, which only caused Ahmed to become even more angry. Before his minders could drag Conti off, the prince pulled a short, curved dagger from inside his thob, and without a second thought, thrust it into his assailant's chest. Avril let out a piercing scream while Ahmed pushed him away and laughed. The bodyguards let go of their prey and could only watch as Conti collapsed on the ground, clutching his chest while gasping for breath. Simon was horrified, and even though the ambassador had warned him about the Black Prince, he hadn't been prepared for this. He turned to the barman and shouted, "For God's sake, call an ambulance." but the man didn't move. Best not get involved, Khalil said, especially remembering he's the defense minister's son, and without his backing, it won't be your name on the bottom of the contract. Simon hesitated while Avril's screams had turned to tears. The prince ignored her as he bent down and slowly extracted the dagger from Conti's chest, causing him to let out a long, whimpering groan, which brought a smile of satisfaction to Ahmed's face. Simon watched in horror as several other foreigners in the room began to slip quietly away, not wanting to be involved in the unfolding drama. Simon would have followed them, but couldn't come to terms with what was happening in front of him. An older man who Simon hadn't noticed walked calmly across the room and whispered in the prince's ear. Ahmed hesitated for a moment before wiping the blade of his dagger clean on Conti's trouser leg. He then adjusted his keffiyeh and walked slowly towards a door that was being held open by one of his followers. He looked back, not at his victim, but at Avril. "If you're still hoping to keep your good looks," said Ahmed, crossing his throat with the dagger, "make sure you keep your mouth shut." He placed the dagger back in its sheath and left without a word, followed by all but one of his entourage. Simon couldn't take his eyes off Conti, who was still trying to stem the flow of blood now oozing from the wound like water from a running tap. Khalil seemed to be the only person in the room who remained calm, as if he were watching a scene from a horror movie and had already seen the last reel. Simon decided to ignore Khalil's advice and go to Conti's aid, hoping he still had time. Then he heard the sound of a siren in the distance. "There's nothing you can do for him now," said Khalil, placing a hand firmly on Simon's arm. "So I suggest you leave before the police arrive, and when you see the Minister of Defense in the morning, just remember you were never here." Simon still didn't move while the sound of the police siren became louder and louder. "I'll pick you up from your hotel at 9:30, so we'll be well in time for your meeting with the minister." Simon stared down at the Italian, who was no longer moving, and reluctantly accepted there was little he could do to help him. After taking one last look at the prostrate body, he made his way out of the club. Once he was on the street, he climbed back into his waiting car. "Back to the hotel," he said when he heard the sound of the siren coming closer and closer. "Get moving," he added even more firmly as the police car swung around the corner and moments later screeched to a halt outside the entrance to the club. That's when he heard the second siren and once again felt guilty. He hadn't gone to the Italian's aid. Simon prayed it was an ambulance and would get there in time. Back in the club, the prince's right-hand man approached Khalil and without a word passing between them, handed the Lebanese agent a thick wad of cash. He too disappeared even without glancing at the victim. Khalil peeled off some notes from the bundle and handed the first payment to the barman, who pocketed the cash. He then offered Avril a bonus, but she threw the money back in his face. Khalil shrugged and gathered up the notes, before handing out similar amounts to some of the girls who'd remained behind. They would claim they hadn't seen the thing, not for the first time. Just as he was handing out the last payment to a waiter, the police came charging into the room. Khalil was still holding on to half the cash, which he immediately handed over to the officer in charge, who pocketed the money before turning to his attention and the body lying in a pool of blood on the floor. Having disposed of the entire bakshish, Khalil made his own exit, not bothering with his 10% on this occasion. But then he had his eyes on a far bigger prize. Once Simon's driver had dropped him back off at the hotel, He took the lift to his suite on the top floor, got undressed, and had a long shower before collapsing onto the bed. He couldn't sleep as the nightmare relentlessly repeated itself without him having to press the playback button. He tried to concentrate on the carefully worded questions he would need to ask the defense minister if he had any chance of finding out if he was aware what his son and Khalil were up to. If he did, he would be catching a plane back to London later that afternoon, as murder wasn't a part of any contract Simon would be willing to sign. But his thoughts kept returning to Conti, who had ended up with a contract he hadn't bargained for. Once again, he prayed that the ambulance got there in time. Simon woke just after 5, his body covered in a sticky sweat. He took another long, cold shower, but nothing was going to wash away the memory of the previous night. He put on a dressing gown, sat down at the end of the bed, and began to pen a series of questions that he hoped would lull the minister into a false sense of security. He finally gave up and got dressed. A navy blue suit his father would have approved of, a white shirt he would be wearing for the first time, and a green silk tie chosen by his wife. He began to pace around the suite, checking his watch every few minutes as he waited for Khalil to join him. Simon made an even greater effort to put his questions in the correct order, aware of how much was at stake when the long-term consequences of the £3 billion contract would guarantee a flow of income and jobs for his countrymen for over a decade or more. If the Saudis backed the British, £1 billion would be transferred to the government coffers, $1 million of which would be deposited into a numbered account in Geneva, with no questions asked as to how it would be disposed of or to whom. A second payment of a further $1 billion would be made once the equipment had been dispatched to Riyadh, and the final payment of another $1 billion would be handed over once the equipment had arrived safely in Riyadh, along with 600 highly trained operatives who would spend the next 6 months instructing the local mariners, pilots, engineers, and foot soldiers on how to operate their newly acquired equipment. Simon checked his watch once again, aware that while ministers could keep you waiting for an hour, sometimes 2, he still needed to be on time for the meeting that morning. When the door finally opened, Simon assumed it would be Hani Khalil who would be joining him before they left for the ministry, but to his surprise, 3 men dressed in police uniforms marched in unannounced. "Are you Simon Hartley?" demanded an officer with 3 silver pips on his shoulder. Before Simon could respond, "Yes," said Simon without hesitation, assuming they had been sent to accompany him to the defense minister's office. But without another word, the 2 young officers stepped forward, grabbed Simon by the arms, thrust them behind his back, and handcuffed him. Simon was about to protest when Khalil entered the room, no suggestion of surprise on his face. He was confident the handcuffs would be removed within moments and he'd be set free, but his agent remained silent, his expression unmoved. When the senior officer said authoritatively, "You are under arrest, Mr. Hartley," it was some time before Simon recovered enough to ask, "On what charge?" "Murder," said the chief of police, as the 2 officers escorted him out of the room. Thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this excerpt from An Eye for an Eye by Jeffrey Archer, available in our library.